Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I want to chat for a few closing minutes now about our economy and our economic situation, because I think it really is something critical that we need to pay a lot of attention to. Yesterday, I had Dean Leonard Waverman, I apologize, on my show talking about the crisis in Canadian prosperity. He's the former dean of the DeGroote School of Business, and he really, I think, laid out a bad prescription for where we are right now with lack of innovation, lack of productivity, lack of prosperity, and the challenges that we've got and how that is harming us from a median disposable income that is now, 30% or so less than the United States, and that it's been flat for 15 years. It's a pretty dismal assessment of our Canadian economy. And then today, Daniel Foch talking about the federal government housing announcements and the challenge being red tape, regulation, debt, deficit, both public and private, and that he was worried that not nearly enough was happening. Tomorrow, I've got a really interesting show with a gentleman talking about the impact of AI, and that AI may take away a lot of the entry-level jobs, and it's a pretty scary kind of a prognosis. So let me tell you, if I could, my assessment of our situation. Number one, I think that we have been running deficits and thereby building up debt that is larger than we've ever had before, and it's unsustainable. I think that you can grow an economy with debt, just like a company can grow with debt, as long as the debt to GDP or the debt to an EBITDA, if it's in a company, or the debt to capital, hopefully starts out as reasonable and then goes down over time as a percentage of either the GDP, if it's a country, or the EBITDA or value, if it is a company. I think ours is now at an unsustainably high level. I worry that if you take in both federal government debt and provincial government debt, you get to be some of the most indebted nations, both provincial and federal added together, in the whole world. And then there was an article this weekend that suggested that private debt was at unbelievably high, almost unsustainable levels. And so private and public debt added up together is at a crazy high amount. And I think a lot of that debt has been built up during the pandemic for social programs, and then also because of other social programs, which I think are critically important, but maybe a little bit too generous than they should be, and we haven't been spending enough money on infrastructure. The U.S. does have a larger debt deficit, not debt necessarily, but deficit as a percentage of their GDP right now. But a lot of it's being spent on infrastructure and productivity efforts. I think our productivity is dismal. I think our innovation is languishing, and I think that has led to a situation where our prosperity is down dramatically. And I think we all feel it when we hear statistics like our real disposable income on average, median, hasn't grown in 15 years. We sort of know that. And that's pretty distressing and bad. And it's a critique of not just our current federal government, but previous governments and provincial governments and municipal governments together, that we have not done the job that we need to do to create the economy that we want. I think there's some other things that are important. I think our top marginal tax rates above 50% are wrong. I don't think the tax rate should get above 50%. I think that there is this visceral negative reaction that when you start spending more of your money going to government, and we got to take federal, provincial, and municipal all added up together, including the GST or HST. And then when it is really more than half of what you make, I think it really is damaging. And I think that history will bear me out that when people start to think that the taxes are at a unjustified amount, I think that people rebel. And part of it might be, not working as hard, or leaving the country, or not investing. And I think that's a problem. The Globe and Mail did a big article a couple of weeks ago that said that the civil service is one of the only areas in our economy that has been growing employment. those are good jobs. Yeah. But I don't think that the civil service should be growing at greater than GDP, and it shouldn't be growing at amounts greater than, or employment numbers greater than the private sector. And frankly, I'm not sure it should be growing at equal to the private sector. And I think that's a problem. And I do think that a lot of our current situation is the result of the lack of a growth agenda. There's been a couple of articles critiquing politicians in the political class and the elite of late, that it's peopled by too many career politicians. There aren't many business people there, and there's too many maybe lawyers and teachers. Nothing that there anything wrong with those people, but that's not everybody in society, and maybe it doesn't represent some of the people that actually know how to create businesses and create innovation and create prosperous opportunities. I think back to some of the most successful political leaders and leadership groups in the past, and it's often been when you've got a very strong finance minister or someone that's got experience in business. I think of the role that John Turner played with Pierre Trudeau, or Paul Martin played with Jean Chrétien, or Jim Flaherty played with Stephen Harper, and I think that it's critically important to have both the people that maybe great retail politicians or populists or people that can really read people and understand people, make great speeches, have charisma and all that kind of stuff. But then it's also really helpful to have in leadership positions in that cabinet, if not frankly in one of the senior positions in that cabinet, finance minister or industry minister or something like that, someone that really understands what it takes to be successful, whether it's municipal government or provincial government or federal government. And frankly, I'm now even criticizing the leader of the official opposition federally, who maybe talks about more innovation and growth than the Liberal Party is doing, but he also, as a career politician, has never really run a business. How can you actually run a country, a province, or a city if you've got no business experience, if you've got no experience actually being out and being innovative, productive? I think that there is a role unquestionably for lawyers and teachers and career politicians, but not if they're everyone that's in the cabinet, everyone that's in the government, everyone that's on council. I think you got to have a combination. And I think that what that has done in the past is created a growth agenda. And I don't think we have a growth agenda and a prosperity agenda today. The Institute of Competitiveness and Prosperity did a really good job back in the early 2000s, really taking a look at Ontario and what we needed to do to grow and be prosperous. And it talked about things like lower deficits, lower debt, such that we could get tax rates below 50% in total. It talked about lowering trade barriers between provinces, and the fact that, and Leonard talked about it a lot yesterday, about how, there's more free trade at times between Ontario and New York State than there is between Ontario and Quebec and Ontario and Alberta. That's a mistake, and that's wrong. And we should be lowering the trade barriers in Canada. That we should be working together for foreign direct investment. Montreal and Toronto shouldn't be competing internationally. They should be saying, come to Canada, rather than come to Montreal or come to Toronto. And Toronto and Mississauga and Vaughan shouldn't be competing. We should be saying, come to Toronto. I think that we're not working as a team, which is a mistake. I think that infrastructure is critically important, and I think that some of the things that the U.S. is doing in their current infrastructure plans in the Inflation Reduction Act are critically important, and we're not doing it. Have you been to LaGuardia Airport recently? It is amazing what the federal government in the United States have done and what the New York state has done in upgrading that airport, such that it used to be some of the most decrepit infrastructure, and it's now just a spectacular new airport. And that's just one example. The train system around New York, the subway system around New York. I just don't understand why we can't do better in Toronto and in Ontario. I think that we need to build ecosystems, and you hear that a lot in the infrastructure, in the innovation area. That we need this ecosystem, we need this social capital, we need people that are working together. too often we don't think about the fact that to work together, you got to have good infrastructure. You got to be able to get from one place to another. The infrastructure and congestion, the congestion that we've got in Toronto today is unbelievable. To get from Mississauga to downtown Toronto or from the airport corporate zone to downtown Toronto, the last couple of days, it's taken me over an hour. Business people in the middle of the day aren't going to do that. We should have good rapid transit connections. We should have reasonable freeway access. We should have a city that works well together. And I worry that we don't today. And I think we need to have a government system that spurs innovation. And I think there's a bunch of things that we need to do in that regard. Accelerated depreciation is one of the things that the federal government announced in regards to, building rental housing. Well, why don't we do that for investments in R&D, in biotech, in high tech, in AI? Why don't we have flow-through shares? We have flow-through shares in mining. Why don't we have flow-through shares in healthcare, in pharma, in biotech, in AI, in other opportunities where we can innovate in the economy? I think that there's been so much focus on this capital gains tax, which I think probably is wrong, but only impacts a very small minority of people. And that's after you've created a huge capital gain by innovation. The better thing is to reduce the risk up front, which flow through shares, R&D tax credits, accelerated depreciation, that can do by reducing the risk of investment up front. And I think the most important thing we could do is reduce red tape and regulation. I really do. We talked a lot on this show about red tape and regulation. The federal government talked about dramatically reducing red tape and regulation in the housing sector. Why can't we reduce it everywhere? Because I do think that one of the things that has been a challenge to business in Canada, we talk about how it takes much longer to get, like 7 to 10 years, a mine or an oil and gas or a nuclear power plant approved, a pipeline approved, than it does to build. The red tape and regulation that people are concerned about in housing is very real and a problem. But it's also a problem in a lot of other sectors of society. I don't think it creates much value. Do I think that things should get approved without good environmental reviews? No. But the environmental reviews don't have to take 5, 7, 10 years. We need to have a far more efficient, effective, growth-oriented, productive-oriented, development-oriented attitude toward our housing, toward exploiting our resources, to partnering up with our Indigenous communities, to creating a more prosperous, productive Canada where we can all enjoy a good, prosperous livelihood and pay our taxes so that we can then have the social programs that we all want. And I worry that we've forgotten that. And we're far more redistributive oriented today in our governments and not enough growth oriented. My 2 cents. Thanks for joining us. That's Brian Crombie on the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I'm on every night on 9:60 a.m. at 6 p.m. Thanks.